May the utterance of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts reflect something of the one who comes to bring life and life to the full. In the way of Christ we seek and pray. Amen. Sometimes I have real questions about why the lectionary committee put certain texts together. You may have discovered that with our two readings today, they are almost paradoxically opposed to each other. One is a grand vision of a new creation, a restoration of long life and prosperity and no more violence. The other is the destruction of the temple and persecution and fear. And how do you make sense of both of them? And in the season of ordinary, now I would expect these texts would make sense in Lent and maybe even Advent, but in the ordinary time, what's going on, lectionary committee? And yet both of these texts, while quite divergent in contrast, tap into an apocalyptic hope. A vision, a dream of God, of some kind that is to come. Why divergent in nature, both look forward to the possibilities that are about to hopefully, and the word is hopefully, may bring some comfort and restoration, peace and comfort. As a congregational minister of almost 19 years in two different traditions, I remember one particular Sunday where there was one person who would arrive just after the service began and exited the building just before everything concluded. And I thought it might be, part of my pastoral and our shared pastoral responsibilities to make some form of connection, just to say hello and the like. And lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, she attended a couple of times, and I noticed her down the street, and I said, "Oh, hi! It was good to see you at church the other day. If I'm available if you'd like to explore anything further, and if we're here to assist in any way, let us know." And she looked at me and said, "Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, I'll let you know," and kept on her merry way. Sometimes I feel that, being hospitable and open is a discipline that you just got to keep pressing at, and you really don't know how things will really roll out. A couple of weeks later, she came to church again, and she stayed a little bit longer, and so I had a bit more of a conversation with her, and she said to me that she's really worried about her husband. And I said, "Well, what's going on?" "Oh, I think he needs a bit of religion," she said. Bit of religion. I go, "What do you mean by that?" "Well, I don't know. I think it'd be really helpful if you and he had a conversation." And I went, "Well, look, if you want to encourage that kind of conversation, I'm more than happy to be a part of that." I didn't see them for about 3 or 4 months. I didn't see her at church for about 3 or 4 months after that. But then one particular Sunday, she came in with a man whom I assumed, but you never know, was her husband. And after the service, we greeted and had a chat around the coffee table. So good that you have coffee and tea and biscuits and things like that. And he said, "Oh, you know what? I'm not really into all this religious stuff. It's all a bit, I don't know. It's just not my cup of tea. You know what I mean?" And he goes, "Okay, well, would you like to have coffee sometime and just kind of chew the fat about things?" And he said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" Okay. So the three of us sat down and had coffee about 2 weeks later. And he goes, "Look, I need to say that I'm not into this God business, and I'm not really into religion, but I am actually really struggling a little bit. Actually, he didn't say that. He said that later. He said he started the whole rhetoric of the litany of all the successes in his life and how he was very good at this and this and this and this and this, and how he wanted to be the best employee at work, and he wanted to be the best husband to his wife and the best person in all of these different arenas. And at the end of the litany of him really sharing his meaning-making frame of how he orientates his life, I asked the question, so how is, you've got this great desire to do all of this, how is that actually going for you? And he said, it's going really well. And at that moment, his wife looked at him with that look that only a wife can look at her husband. And he looked at her and then looked at me and said, actually, it isn't going as well as I would like. It isn't going as well as I would like. These two texts today reflect great contrasting visions, as I said. For I'm about to create a new heaven and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I'm about to create a new Jerusalem as a joy, and its people as a delight. In contrast, when some of them were speaking about the temple and how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, as for these things you see, the day will come when not one stone will be left upon another, and all will be thrown down. All will be thrown down. Two deep contrasting images. I'm glad that couple didn't come to church the day these two texts were set to be read. For the Isaiah text, the Hebrew people had in their deep memory and in their storytelling what oppression and subordination and slavery were all about. They knew what it was like to have their young ones cut down, their families ripped apart, to see trauma and the very sacred places of meaning-making being ripped to shreds. And this is the dream of Yahweh, the dream of their God that would see life and life to the full, an abundance of life. A really extreme vision where lions and lambs lie down with each other. Although I was interested by the dust, the snake that eats dust, I guess because it doesn't need to hurt anyone anymore, it'll just eat the dust and it'll be fine. The cultural memories preserved in their biblical tradition were of enslavement. And in the shadow of the Babylonian Empire, these narratives become forming narratives for a new reality, a new way of being, a new creation. And they are powerful and full of hope in the midst of great suffering and despair. Luke Acts has an apocalyptic frame to it as well. And mainline churches, like us in the Uniting Church, tread carefully when we come to apocalyptic traditions, because we don't want to feed into a paranoia about things. But we also know that these traditions have emerged again in the context of fear and suffering and depression, and trying to make sense of that in the dream of God that is reconciling and renewing all creation. reconciling and renewing all things. And instead of Jerusalem being the joy and the delight, it is the temple is being destroyed. Now, feeding this text is probably the ransack, it's 70 AD or CE of the temple by the Roman Empire. And so this memory connects with the text. And also the persecution that this fledgling Jesus movement was experiencing and would experience from not only part of their own Jewish heritage, but also the empire that killed their leader, their rabbi, their teacher. And so great fear is fed into this text, and yet also there is the image of hope. This salvation of souls piece at the end of the text. Not a hair on your head would perish. Quite interesting pieces, really. But very realistic, if you like, in terms of the fear that was embodied and embedded in that time, in that context. Now, I don't know about you, but I have seen this happen in my family and in my context, that when tragedy hits, we can't help but want to make sense of it. And in a vacuum, we can't help but start to put things together that may not necessarily always be that helpful. Sometimes our fear drives us to think things, and our hope moves to despair. And there is some of that dynamic that takes place in the biblical texts. Looking forward to the possibility of what is a dialogue of both the possibilities of good and the fear of what can be taken away and destroyed. And so when we hear these texts, we hear and see that these tensions are also present in our own unknowing. And being attentive to this with the dream of the possibility of the divine is recorded for us in the biblical witness, for our reflection, not to give certitude, but to orientate us within a broader witness of challenge, oppression, and hope. Now, when I think about these texts and how on earth they relate to our time today, there is a tendency to internalize and look at from a psychological point of view, or the great injustices of our time, climate change, asylum seekers, and I think these are important. But one line of thinking is that I've been engaging with, which I think has been quite helpful, has come from Jeremy Rifkin, who has written a book called The Third Industrial Revolution. It's a New York Times bestseller. He has his critics and he has his supporters, like most people. But this kind of thinking sets us in a particular framework, in a particular time, in a particular context that I think might be helpful to see what is the hope or the dream of God in our context and in our time. The first industrial revolution, if you like, was there are kind of two drivers that Rifkin uses. One is the technology of communication, and the other is around power, as in what is the energy source and how is that energy source used? So communication and energy. In the first industrial revolution, and this there's some, of course there were Bronze Ages and steel. There's some simplicity in this thinking which I must admit to, but. In his argument is in the first industrial revolution, the printing press really became a huge piece in terms of the change of the art of communication. And the steam engine also became, powered by wood and coal, became two of the key pieces that drove this industrial revolution. Part of the tradition of the Uniting Church, the Methodists, was an attempt to contextually adapt, if you like, to these new industrial cities that have been merged with this gospel of Christ, this good news of Christ. And how to do that outside of the parochial locked down system that Methodism was constrained by in terms of its Anglican heritage. Although John Wesley would always say he remained an Anglican till he died, and not to create a whole new tradition. But the printing press fundamentally changed the trajectory of the expression of the Christian faith in ways that have contributed to us sitting here today. And you may or may not be aware of that, but the Reformed tradition, the Protestant tradition, the Presbyterian tradition, the printing of the Bible, the printing of the hymn books, the printing of prayer books, making it accessible to wider communities rather than being centralized in a person who is generally the cleric or the priest, has fundamentally changed a huge, the tradition that we sit in and that are a part of. To have the ideas of the reformers being printed and sent and distributed was quite powerful and shifted religion and political life significantly with the rise of nation states and so on and so forth. The second industrial revolution is driven by oil and electronic communication. From the telegraph to the radio to the television. And oil and mass production is part of that second wave. The first, if you like, was centralized as part of kind of connecting with the British Empire. The second is much more located within the US with oil and cars. And today we have just about everything almost made out of plastic. Pharmaceuticals, Tupperware, even airlines are now made of carbon fiber. There's a piece around that. But this mass production liberated, in some ways, labor. Women were no longer just the labor bearers, but there were labor-saving devices, and with technology, no longer were women seen as just the place where men put their seed for in earth for babies to grow. There was a combination of the genetics and life, and individual movement became a big piece in that. And it could be said that the evangelical and charismatic movements began to get significant currency around an individual relationship with God that empowered you to be blessed, and so on and so forth. In the progressive traditions, individual rights becomes really important. And in this particular era, that mobilizing becomes a big piece. In the first industrial revolution, God was seen more like the architect of the universe who ordered the laws. And even in psychology, you noticed it affected, when people were angry, they just needed to let off a bit of steam, like pressure was building, like in a steam engine. These things frame the thinking. In this second industrial revolution, it was about empowered to be individuals and to consume and to engage. The third revolution that we are actually a part of now, the power generation and the communication has hit another milestone. Renewables, no longer coal and oil, but renewables is changing the landscape, and the internet is also changing how we communicate. Network thinking for millennials and even for my generation, it has changed from the mass communication that we'd been accustomed to. I remember as a Christian who also accepted that my sexuality was it took me a while, gift of God, that the internet provided a global network of people globally that I could connect with and develop friends all over the world, where my own community could not support that, and even my own family could not support that. very privileged to be in a time where that kind of global communication has become available, and that kind of network thinking and access to that is quite prevalent. Today, Facebook and as I've been told by one of my millennial friends, Instagram and Snapchat. I'm still scared about Snapchat, where you just speak little bits to each other and the like, have really fundamentally changed how we communicate. We've seen this in the Trump election, where Facebook analytics deliberately use the limbic responses to get alignment in this space. So what does the gospel or the dream of God look like in this particular context? One of the things that we've noticed with millennials is a shift away from the individual thinking to that there is a sense of belonging to the biosphere, that the environment and the climate is linked to who we are and our future and our possibilities and our dreams, not just about individual empowerment. In fact, that's almost seen as a self-indulgent trajectory. Now, I am painting it black and white just for illustrative examples, but that we are connected to each other and to the environment. And for the Christian tradition, I wonder if it's also helpful to say that we are also connected to God in this. But it changes the image of God from the architect to the individual empowerer and blesser to the one who is holding us all in a connection of life. That we are all creatures of creation, and that the Creator is the network of relationships, the space between the I and the you in complexity, where creation emerges time and time again. Another image that is beginning to emerge, unsettling for some, challenging for others. That young chap who that I started off with started to attend church and to explore what on earth Christianity may have to offer. About 2 years down the track, he came to me and said, "I want to be baptized, Ben." I said, "Oh, that's news, that's good. Tell me, what does that mean for you?" He said to me, "I have been living a life that is all about my personal fulfillment and betterment. But something caught me, and it is a vision of what it means to be human that says that I am part of some great creative flow, a mysterious flow, but that I am a creature of creation, and I am called to a kinship with all of creation. And that in this there is a flourishing of life and life to the full. And I want to follow this Jesus way." So, well, that's a good witness, isn't it? That's a good testimony to why a bath, which baptism symbolizes, a washing clean and walking into a new way, this way that we see in the good news of Christ for all creation. We are in a place where I think we are encouraged to dream more boldly. The Yahwist is abundant in the dream of the possibilities. We can take inspiration of the destruction of the temple as a symbol, or the flourishing and the restoration. We could say the destruction of earth or the flourishing of earth, the place where we dwell. The dream of God manifest in hope is part of the story that continually informs us about what it means to be human. and to live into the possibility of divine life with each other. Renewable energy actually calls for distributive sensibilities. Unfortunately, our government sold the electric grid off to a big multinational. But in other places, they share the wind and the solar, and it's much more local energy production. Food, there's a localization and a closer relationships with the environment, how to live sustainably, which is actually a really beautiful thing. And technology means that we can resource thinking globally. We can ask questions and find that globally. Now, I do have some challenges with Google as the great gatekeeper. But I think there will come a day where politically that will need to be regulated for the common good at some point, or other emergences will happen. But salvation, healing, and wholeness is beginning to look different again in this age, and we are encouraged to dream. So let us dream the dreams of God.